Middle-aged farmer took lost Apache woman in. Now his home has warmth, and she calls him husband. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The last of the light slid across the edge of the yard as Elias Brannock came out of the house carrying a lantern. He had spent the day patching fence posts along the south pasture, and his shoulders ached, the kind of ache he knew too well from long years of the same work. At 43, Elias was broad in the frame but worn in the face, a man who lived alone and had not laughed in years. The farm wasn't much, but it kept him alive, and that was all he asked of it anymore. He had buried his wife and unborn child a decade ago, and since then each day had been a matter of keeping things standing. The house, the barn, himself. The mule stamped in its stall, and Elias lowered the lantern to check the latch. That was when he saw her. At first he thought it was a bundle of rags left by a traveler, but the shape moved and the faint outline of a body showed against the dirt. A woman lay half in shadow near the barn wall, curled on her side, her knees drawn up like she was trying to hold herself together. He froze for a moment, unsure whether this was danger brought to his door. He listened. The yard was still, only the sound of the wind dragging dust across the boards. Elias stepped closer, lantern light falling over her. She was young, no more than 30, with long black hair tangled across her face. Her dress was torn and filthy, the fabric split at the seams so that her shoulder and the upper swell of her chest were bare to the night air. Her feet were cut raw, streaked with dried blood and dirt. Elias crouched, touched her wrist. A pulse. Weak but steady. She wasn't drunk, wasn't dead, just finished, worn out by miles of walking. He felt the weight of a choice press on him. He could walk back to the house, lock the door, leave her where she was. Nobody in town would blame him. She was Apache, and most folks around here spat that word like it carried plague. But he thought about the grave he had dug years ago, the one he still passed every time he worked the North Field. He remembered what it felt like to lose somebody without anyone else lifting a hand to help. He wasn't about to repeat that. He slid his arms under her carefully, surprised by how little weight she carried, and lifted her as if she were no heavier than a child. Her head rested against his chest, her breath hot but shallow. He carried her inside the barn where it was warmer, laid her on a dry bed of straw in the corner, and tucked a folded blanket under her neck. She stirred, eyes flicking open for a second, dark and sharp even through exhaustion. Fear flashed there. She didn't know who he was or what he meant to do. Elias saw it and stepped back, giving her space. He had no intention of frightening her more than life already had. He went to the trough, dipped a tin ladle into the cool water, and brought it to her. "Here," he said, his voice low and even. She blinked, hesitated, then drank in small swallows that clicked in her throat. He cut a heel of bread from his pocket ration and laid it on a crate beside her, added a strip of salt pork. She reached for the bread with shaking fingers, tore off a piece, and chewed slowly like someone who hadn't eaten in days. Elias sat back on an overturned bucket, keeping the lantern between them. He studied her. She was Apache, no doubt. Pretty too, in a raw, worn-down way that came from hardship more than vanity. The torn blouse revealed curves she couldn't hide, but he forced himself to look at her face instead. A strong jaw, deep eyes, the look of someone who had been cast out and had nowhere left to go. "Name?" he asked after a while. Her lips parted. "Naya," she said softly, her accent thick but the word clear. He nodded once. "Elias." They sat in silence. She ate. He kept watch. In his head, Elias turned the situation over like a problem of tools and boards. She had no shoes, no pack, nothing to her name. Someone had run her out of town, most likely with a threat behind her. If he left her out here, she would be dead by morning. If he took her inside, the town would soon hear he was keeping company with an Apache woman. Either way, his life would change. Naya, for her part, felt her pulse begin to slow as the food filled her stomach. She had walked 3 days after being accused of stealing bread in town, chased out with nothing but the dress on her back. She had been ready to collapse and not wake again. Now this man, This tall, broad-shouldered farmer with tired eyes was giving her water, food, a place to lie down. She didn't trust it. Men rarely gave anything without wanting something back. But his hands had stayed steady, never reaching for her, never pressing closer than they needed to. That counted for more than she expected. Elias dragged a feed sack near the barn door and laid it out flat. He wasn't about to sleep in the house while a stranger rested out here. If she tried to run, he'd hear it. If trouble came looking for her, he'd be ready. He stretched out, set the lantern low between them, and closed his eyes. The mule shifted. The barn settled. Outside, the wind died down. Inside, one man and one woman lay awake longer than they wanted, listening to each other breathe, both unsure what the next morning would bring, but knowing that for now, neither of them was alone. The morning broke pale and dry, a thin sheet of light creeping through the cracks of the barn wall. Elias woke stiff from the feed sack near the door, rubbing his shoulder where the boards had pressed through the night. His first thought was of her. He turned his head toward the corner where he had left her. Naya was awake, propped on one elbow, the blanket pulled around her shoulders, her dark hair falling into her face. She was watching him, wary, her eyes sharp even with exhaustion. Elias sat up slow, careful not to startle her. He noticed she hadn't touched the pork, only the bread. That told him something. Hunger was strong enough to make anyone eat what was given, but she had avoided the meat. He stored the thought away. Folks in town would have called it superstition or pride, but Elias had lived enough years to know people had reasons for what they did. "Water?" he asked, raising the ladle. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. He crossed the space between them and held it out, but not too close. She reached, fingers trembling, and drank. Her lips were cracked, her hands raw, but she kept her back straight, refusing to show weakness. Elias studied her. She looked stronger in the light, skin bronze from sun, jaw firm despite her thinness. Her dress was worse than he thought the night before. Torn at the seams, gaping at the chest, one sleeve hanging half off. Her legs showed bruises where the fabric had ridden up. He understood now why she had pulled the blanket so tight around her. He wondered if she thought he might take advantage. The truth was, the sight of her stirred things in him he hadn't felt in years, but he buried it down deep. She was a person in need, not a body to be used. He wouldn't be like the men who had cast her out. He poured another ladle of water and set it within reach. "You can stay here today," he said quietly. "Get your strength back. No one will bother you in this barn." Her eyes narrowed at his words. She understood most of them, he could tell. "Why?" she asked finally, voice rough, accent thick. Elias scratched at the gray in his beard, thinking of how to answer. "Because leaving you out there would make me no better than the men who sent you away." It was the truth, plain and heavy. She held his gaze a long moment, then looked away. He saw a faint tremor in her hands ease. As the day pushed on, Elias set about his chores. He forked hay, checked the mule's hooves, repaired a hinge on the side stall. He worked with the steady patience of a man who had lived by routine for years. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught her watching him, always silent, her face unreadable. Mid-morning, he returned with a small bowl of beans and bread from the house. He set it near her without a word. She picked at the food carefully, eating slow. When she finished, she rose unsteadily, surprising him, and took the bowl to the water trough to wash it out. Elias didn't move, didn't offer to take it from her. He simply watched as she bent over, her bare feet pressing into the packed dirt floor, her torn dress slipping along her back. She scrubbed the bowl with her hands until it shone, then set it carefully on the crate. Elias felt something shift in that small act. She wasn't just taking, she was showing him she wasn't a beggar. Later, when he went to mend a broken harness strap, she approached slowly. She pointed at the leather, then at the needle and thread hanging on the wall. He handed them over. Her fingers were quick, practiced. She stitched the tear closed with steady hands and gave the strap back to him without a word. Elias pulled against the repair, testing its strength, and found it sound. He gave her a single nod. Her lips tightened, almost a smile, then faded back into caution. As the day stretched, Elias's mind circled questions he hadn't asked the night before, questions he knew others would ask if they found out. Where'd she come from? Who had driven her out? Why was she alone? He didn't press her. He knew too well what it felt like to have pain used against you. That evening, as the sky reddened and the air cooled, she finally spoke again. "Town," she said, her voice low, broken English struggling against the weight of memory. "They say I take bread." Elias understood at once. He pictured the scene in his mind. Her in that town, hungry, maybe desperate enough to reach for food, maybe accused without proof. He could see the faces of the men there, their easy hatred, their eagerness to cast her out. He felt his chest tighten. He had lost his family to fever years ago, buried them alone. The townsfolk had offered words, but not one had stayed to help. He had lived with silence ever since. Now here was another person cast aside, another soul no one wanted. "You won't be harmed here," he said firmly. His voice didn't rise, but the conviction in it filled the barn. Naya pulled the blanket tighter around herself, studying him. For the first time since she had appeared in his yard, her shoulders eased a little. She was still afraid, that much was clear, but not of him. Not tonight. Elias turned down the lantern as the mule settled into straw. He spread his feed sack pallet near the door again, leaving the bed to her. She lay back slowly, her eyes closing, but before sleep took her, she whispered one word. "Thank you." Elias heard it in the dark and lay awake a long time afterward, staring at the ceiling beams. He wondered what the next days would bring. He wondered what line he had just crossed, taking her in. But deep down, past fear and worry, he felt something he hadn't in years, a reason to share the silence. The next morning came with a pale sun pushing over the ridge and the smell of damp earth hanging low after a weeknight rain. Elias rose first, as he always did, stretching the stiffness from his back before heading to the yard with the water pail. He returned to find Naya sitting up on the straw, the blanket folded neatly at her side. She was awake, alert, her dark eyes following his every move. She had survived the night, though her face still carried the strain of exhaustion. He set the pail down and crouched to check the mule's hoof, and when he looked up again, she was on her feet, barefoot still but standing steady. Elias realized she had not once asked for shoes, for clothing, or for anything more than what he had said in front of her. She had asked only for water, only answered when spoken to. A part of him knew listeners might wonder, who was she really, and what had brought her to this desperate point? The answers trickled out slowly, like water through a narrow crack. He watched as she approached the trough, knelt, and splashed her face. The dirt ran off her cheeks, revealing smooth bronze skin underneath. When she caught him looking, she pulled her hair across her face, as if ashamed. Elias turned back to his work, keeping his eyes on the harness strap in his hands. He didn't want her to think he was measuring her like the men in town would have. Breakfast was plain beans and bread again. He set the bowl between them and left her to take what she wished. This time, she ate more. When she finished, she rose without asking and carried the bowl outside to wash it. He followed at a distance, curious. She knelt at the trough again, scrubbing it clean with her hands until the clay shone, then set it upside down to dry. It was the same thing she had done the day before, but today she did it quicker, with a steadier hand. Elias realized she was making it clear. She wouldn't live here as charity. He thought about asking more questions, about her people, about the town, about where she had been before she staggered into his yard. But he knew the danger of asking too soon. He himself hadn't spoken about his wife or the child he buried in more than a decade. Some wounds needed silence. By mid-morning, he was repairing a loose plank on the south wall of the barn. He heard soft steps behind him and turned. Naya stood holding a hammer from the tool rack. She offered it without a word, and when he took it, she pointed at the nailed box sitting out of his reach on the other side of the beam. He nodded once, the smallest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She had chosen to help. Together they worked in quiet rhythm. He held the plank steady, and she drove nails with sure strikes that surprised him. She wasn't guessing at the task. She knew how to use tools. It raised questions he hadn't asked. Had she worked like this before? Did her people teach her? Or had she learned in some camp where she had been made to labor? He kept the questions to himself, but felt the answers pressing in his chest. Later, as he brushed down the mule. She appeared at his side again with a bundle of straw. She scrubbed the trough clean while he worked the curry comb. The way she moved told him she had spent her life working, not watching. Hardship had made her strong in ways softer lives never demanded. He respected that. When the chores were done, Elias sat outside the barn on an upturned bucket, lantern cooling in his hands though the sun was already high. Naya sat nearby, her knees drawn to her chest, the blanket around her shoulders again. She watched the yard as if expecting someone to come. Her eyes kept flicking to the road. "You afraid someone will follow?" Elias asked finally, his voice quiet. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Men. From town." Her English was broken, but the meaning was clear. "They won't come here," he said, though in truth he couldn't be sure. Still, the firmness of his words mattered. He had been wondering himself, if she had been accused of theft, had someone put a price on her? Would men come looking for her? Or would they wash their hands and forget? He weighed the risk and found he didn't care. He'd made his choice the night he carried her inside. The afternoon passed with steady labor. He split wood, and she gathered kindling. He hauled water, and she carried it to the trough. By the time the sun dropped low, the barn looked cleaner, straighter, more ordered than it had in months. Elias noticed the difference and couldn't ignore it. Her hands, her quiet presence, had begun to shape his place. That night, when the lantern burned low again, she sat cross-legged on the straw and spoke without him asking. "I walked 3 days. No food, no shoes." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "They say thief. I take bread for child." Elias froze at the word. "Child?" he asked carefully. Her eyes went hard. Her voice dropped. "Not mine. Widow's boy. Hungry." He felt his jaw tighten. She hadn't stolen for herself, but for someone else's child. The town had driven her out for that. His respect for her grew heavier, sharper. He thought of his own loss, of the grave in the north field, and wondered if fate had placed her here for a reason. "You did right," he said, and he meant it. Whatever they said, you did right. Her eyes flicked up at him, uncertain. Then she nodded once, slow, as if she wanted to believe him but didn't yet know if she could. Elias spread his pallet near the door again, same as before, though his bones ached for a bed. He glanced once more at her as she curled into the blanket. She had come to his barn broken, but already the shape of things was changing. He felt it, and though he didn't say the words out loud, he knew she would not be leaving tomorrow. The morning came with a clear sky and the smell of dust settling after wind the night. Elias knew the flour sack was nearly empty, the nail box down to a handful, and the mule's shoes thinning. He couldn't put it off any longer. A trip into town was needed. He also knew it was the thing Naya feared most. She had not said the words, but he had seen the way her eyes tracked the road, the way her shoulders tensed when a mule brayed, as if expecting strangers to answer back. He watched her while he hitched the wagon, weighing whether to leave her behind or take her with him. If he left her, the chance of men wandering past the farm was small but real, and she would be alone. If he took her, she would be seen. Folks in town would have their questions. Elias hated questions, but he had made his choice the night he carried her into the barn. He decided it was better they saw her by his side than guessed his shadows. He stepped into the barn and spoke plain. "I have to go to town. Best you come with me." Her brow furrowed. She pulled the blanket tighter and shook her head once. He didn't press, just waited. After a moment, she looked at his face at the steady way he stood, and then nodded. She rose, barefoot still, and walked to the wagon. He noticed again the state of her dress. Torn across the chest, pulled thin at the hip, unfit for town. He went back inside and brought out his late wife's shawl, folded and tucked away for years. He handed it to her without a word. She hesitated, then draped it over her shoulders. The wool was worn but whole, the fringe covering the gashes in her blouse. For a moment, she pressed her cheek against it like she could feel the warmth of another life in its threads. Elias saw it and felt a pang in his chest. He pushed it down. The road into town was a long line of hard-packed dirt with mesquite crowding the edges. Naya sat stiff beside him, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon as if she might bolt at any sound behind them. Elias kept his pace steady, the mule plodding without hurry. He spoke only once, low enough for her to hear but firm. "No one touches you. If they try, they'll answer to me." When the wagon rattled into the main street, heads turned. A couple of men on the boardwalk stopped their talk, eyes fixed on the dark-haired woman beside him. A woman with a basket paused mid-step. Elias kept his gaze straight ahead. At the mercantile, he tied off the mule and stepped down. Naya hesitated but followed, her bare feet silent on the boards. Inside, Mrs. Bonham stood behind the counter, a woman known for her sharp eye and sharper tongue. She took one look at Naya, then at Elias, and raised a brow. "You bringing company now, Brannock?" she asked. Elias set the list on the counter. "Flour, nails, mule shoes. And if you've got cloth, thread, and moccasins or size." He said it plain, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mrs. Bonham studied him, then the woman at his side. Naya's chin was low, but her eyes didn't waver. After a pause, Mrs. Bonham called to the back and soon laid out the items. Soft-soled moccasins, simple blue cloth, a packet of needles, and thread. Elias placed coin on the counter, more than needed. Mrs. Bonham pushed the change back with a look that carried a rare softness. "See, she wears those shoes. Town's ground isn't kind." Naya lowered her head, but murmured, "Thank you." The words were halting, but they carried. On the way out, a man leaning against a post spat into the dust. "Taking in strays, Brannock?" he muttered, voice loud enough to carry. Elias stopped, turned his head slow, and met the man's eyes. "Taking care of my place," he said. His voice was steady, without heat, but there was weight in it. The man looked away first. They rode home by the long road, past the creek where the willow trees broke the wind. Naya sat quieter than before, her shawl tight around her shoulders, her new moccasins on her feet. Elias kept his eyes forward, but his mind circled the day. He knew people would talk. He knew the stares would follow. But what mattered to him was this. She had walked into town beside him, and she had walked out still at his side. That evening, as he poured feed into the trough and she folded the new cloth in her lap, she asked in a voice so low he almost missed it, "You not afraid?" He thought about it, hands rough from years of work resting on the bucket's rim. "I've lived afraid before. Didn't change a damn thing. I'll stand by what I've chosen." She studied him a long while, then lowered her gaze to the cloth in her hands. For the first time, her mouth bent into the faintest curve, not quite a smile, but close enough to tell him she believed him. That night, when he set his pallet by the door as usual, she spoke before he lay down. "You safe, man." The words were awkward, uncertain, but they carried more than thanks. Elias turned his head, meeting her eyes across the lantern's glow. He said nothing, but inside he felt something ease. For the first time in years, the silence of his house did not feel empty. The next morning came with a slow warmth creeping across the yard, the kind of light that showed every crack in the boards and every nail that had rusted in place. Elias rose from his pallet near the barn door and rubbed the stiffness from his neck. He had lived like this for years, bare, simple, without thought of comfort. Now, with Naya folding the blanket where she had slept, he felt the plainness of his life more clearly than ever. She moved quietly, but every motion seemed to straighten what had long been left crooked. She wore the blue cloth Mrs. Bonham had sold them, roughly stitched into a simple dress overnight with a thread and needle. The seams were uneven, but it held across her chest where the old blouse had torn, and it gave her a dignity she hadn't had before. The moccasins fit snug on her feet, covering the cuts that had nearly hobbled her. She looked different already, still weary, but stronger. Elias poured coffee into 2 tin cups, setting one in front of her on the crate they used as a table. He wasn't sure if she even liked it, but she drank anyway, her face tightening at the bitter taste. He felt himself almost smile. He noticed she kept glancing at the house. In all the days since she'd arrived, she hadn't stepped past its door. The barn had been her refuge, her shield. He realized anyone listening to this story might ask why he had not offered the house earlier, why he kept her in straw while he slept under a roof. The answer was simple. Trust took time, and he had wanted her to feel safe enough to choose when she was ready. He set his cup down. "You can use the house now. he said. There's a bed. You don't need to sleep in here anymore. Her eyes flicked up cautious. Your house? She asked, her accent rough around the words. Mine, he answered. But it doesn't mean only mine. Not if you're here. For a long moment, she said nothing, her fingers tightening around the cup. Then, with a small nod, she rose and followed him across the yard. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and old dust. The table held little more than a tin plate and knife. The walls were bare except for a shelf with a Bible and a pair of candlesticks, relics from a life he no longer touched. Elias felt the hollowness of it, but Naya moved slow and steady through the room, taking it in with sharp eyes. She touched the shelf with the tips of her fingers, brushed the table clean of dust with her palm. This all? She asked. All, he said simply. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to the stove, crouched, and checked the firebox with the same skill she'd shown with the harness strap. She stacked kindling, struck a spark with the flint, and coaxed the flame until it caught. Elias stood back, surprised at the ease with which she claimed the task. He realized she wasn't asking for permission. She was making herself useful, making herself part of the house. The day passed with both of them working side by side in ways neither had expected. Elias chopped wood, and Naya carried it inside, stacking it neatly by the stove. He mended a gate, and she swept the yard, driving dust and scraps into piles with a broom made from straw and twine. She cooked beans at midday, seasoning them with herbs she had picked behind the barn. Elias hadn't tasted food with flavor in years. He didn't say it aloud, but when he cleaned the pot after, she noticed and allowed herself the faintest laugh. That evening, they sat at the table together. 2 bowls, 2 cups. Elias found himself speaking more than usual. He told her about the North Field, about how the soil there never yielded enough, and how he had nearly sold the farm after his wife's passing. He didn't give details, but he didn't hide the truth either. She listened without interruption, her eyes steady on him, and when he fell quiet, she said softly, I know loss. She did not explain further, but she didn't have to. Before bed, Elias brought out a folded quilt from the chest and laid it over the bed in the small room. Yours, he said. She hesitated, then touched the fabric with careful fingers, as if afraid it might vanish. You, she asked, pointing to the door. I'll keep to the chair by the stove, he answered, until you're ready for more. She nodded, her eyes meeting his for a long moment before she lowered them. It was trust, fragile and still forming, but it was there. That night, as Elias sat in the chair listening to the steady crackle of the stove, he thought about how quickly his house had changed. Just days ago, it had been silent, lifeless, a place where he slept but did not live. Now the air carried the sound of another's breathing, the faint shift of quilts, the knowledge that he was no longer alone. He felt the weight of a year's lift just slightly, and for the first time in a long while, he did not dread the morning to come. The next days settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected. Naya slept in the bed with the quilt Elias had laid out, and he kept to the chair by the stove or the pallet near the door. Each morning he rose early, lit the lantern, and stepped into the yard, and each morning she followed, quieter but steadier with every step. By the 4th day, it was no longer her watching him work. It was her working beside him, carrying water, sweeping dust, stitching what was torn. The silence between them no longer felt tense. It felt chosen, but silence could not hold back the world outside. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by now people knew. Elias had brought the Apache woman into his house. He had not just given her food or let her sleep in the barn. He had placed her under his roof, and that carried meaning others would not leave alone. Elias knew listeners might ask. Had no one come to test him yet? No man with too many questions or a grin that carried insult? The answer came before long. It was near midday when Elias heard the sound of hooves on the hard road. He stepped out from the barn, rag in hand, and saw 2 riders slowing their pace as they turned up his path. They weren't neighbors he knew well, just men from town who worked odd jobs around the livery. They pulled their reins and stopped short of the porch, eyes cutting past him to the shadow of Naya moving inside. Brannock, one of them called, spitting into the dirt. Here you've got company now. Didn't figure you for a man to take in strays. His tone made plain what the word meant. Elias said nothing at first. He folded the rag, slid it into his pocket, and stepped closer until the two men shifted in their saddles. "My land, my house, not yours to question," he said. His voice was low, steady, but carried weight enough to press the space flat between them. The second rider smirked. "Town don't see it that way. Town says she was a thief. We saw her driven out. And here she is in your bed." Elias cut him off. "Enough." The word landed hard, like the crack of a hammer. "She's under my roof. That's the end of it." The first man narrowed his eyes. "You setting yourself against the town, Brannock? For her." Elias stepped forward until his boots touched the horse's hooves. He looked up, unblinking. "I'm setting myself for what's mine to keep. You've had your say. Now ride." The men shifted, the moment stretching tight. Then one spat again, muttered a curse, and turned his horse. The other followed, their dust hanging in the air long after they were gone. When Elias turned back to the house, Naya stood in the doorway, shawl pulled around her shoulders, eyes dark with fear. She had heard every word. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Elias nodded once. "You're safe here. Don't matter what they say." Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she stepped aside, letting him in. Inside, the air was thick with quiet. Naya busied herself with the stew pot, but her hands shook slightly as she cut the herbs. Elias sat at the table, watching. He thought about the questions listeners would have. Had he truly meant what he said outside? Would he stand against the whole town for her? He realized the answer was already made. He had drawn the line in front of those men, and he would not back away from it. That night, after the dishes were cleaned and the stove fed, Elias sat in his chair as usual. But when Naya appeared in the doorway of the small bedroom, she held the quilt in her hands. She hesitated, then spread it over him where he Saturday you cold, she said softly. He looked at her, surprised. "I'll be fine." She shook her head, leaving the quilt. For the first time, her hand brushed his shoulder as she turned away. The touch was brief, but it lingered like a mark burned into him. When she lay down again, Elias sat under the quilt, staring at the dying fire. The house was no longer just his. It carried her presence, her fear, and her quiet defiance. He knew trouble would come again, maybe harder next time, but he also knew he would not send her away. The decision had already been made, and both of them felt it. The morning after the riders had come and gone, the yard felt heavier, as if their words still hung in the dust. Elias stepped out early with the pail, his shoulders set harder than usual. And when he turned back, he saw Naya at the door of the house, shawl around her, eyes searching the road before she looked at him. He understood what listeners might wonder. Did she truly trust him now that the danger had shown itself? Or was she waiting for him to change, to bend under the weight of the town's judgment? Her staying in the doorway answered part of it. She hadn't run. The day carried them into work, as it always did. Elias split wood at the chopping block, and Naya gathered the pieces, stacking them neat against the wall. She swept the porch with even strokes, her moccasins soft against the boards, and he realized the house looked more like a place lived in than it had in years. Inside, she boiled beans with the herbs she had picked behind the barn, the smell stronger than the plain fare he had grown used to. He ate slow that noon, and when she set a piece of bread beside his bowl without looking at him, he caught himself thinking of it not as charity, but as a woman keeping a home. Afterward, she surprised him by asking for the harness. Her English was broken, but she pointed, said, "Need fix." He fetched the leather, handed her the awl and thread, and sat quiet as she worked. Her hands were steady, pressing the stitch clean, and he saw again that she knew labor, that her strength wasn't just for herself, but for anyone who stood beside her. Listeners might have asked, was she always this capable, or had hardship forced it into her? He knew the answer didn't matter. What mattered was that every task she touched, she left better. Later in the afternoon, he led her out to the north field, the one he rarely spoke of. The soil there was thin, stubborn, never giving what he needed. He hadn't worked it properly since the fever had taken his wife and the unborn child buried beneath the lone cedar at its edge. He hadn't planned to bring Naya there, but something in him wanted her to see it, to understand what weighed on him. This field, he said, leaning on the fence rail, never gave back what it took. I stopped trying. She stood beside him, looking over the hard earth. After a long silence, she said, "Still ground. Still can grow." Her voice was soft but carried certainty. He turned, met her eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt the thought of trying again was not foolish. As evening came, they sat on the porch steps, the sun sinking behind the ridge. The quiet stretched between them, but it was no longer sharp. She shifted closer, her shawl brushing his arm. He felt her warmth through the cloth. He didn't move away. Inside, after supper, Elias prepared to take his usual place in the chair by the stove. But Naya stepped from the bedroom doorway, quilt in her hands again. She set it on the bed and looked at him, her gaze steady though her hands trembled slightly. "No chair," she said. "Bed big enough." Elias froze, his breath caught in his chest. He thought of what listeners might ask. Was this trust or fear? Was she offering out of choice or out of need? Her eyes gave him the answer. She wasn't afraid. She was asking him to share the space, to show her he could stay close without harm. He rose slowly, not rushing. "Only if you want," he said. She nodded once, firm, and turned back to the bed. That night, they lay side by side under the quilt, his body stiff at first, hers turned away, both listening to the crackle of the stove in the next room. Then, slowly, she shifted back, her shoulder brushing his chest. Elias let out a long breath, lifted his arm, and let it rest lightly across her waist. She didn't flinch. Instead, her hand slid to rest over his, pressing it there. No words followed, no hurried promises. Just the steady rhythm of two people breathing in the same space, neither alone anymore. For the first time in years, Elias slept without waking in the dark. The next morning carried a new weight in the air. The house no longer felt divided between chair and bed, between him and her. When Elias woke, Naya was already sitting up, hair loose around her shoulders, the quilt gathered across her lap. She glanced at him once, a quick look, then turned away, but the faintest color touched her cheeks. Listeners might have wondered whether the night had changed something between them, whether it was only comfort or the beginning of something deeper. Elias knew without speaking. It was both. He swung his legs from the bed, boots thudding softly on the floor, and she rose soon after. Together, they moved through the morning in quiet rhythm. She ground meal for the porridge while he fed the mule. She swept the porch while he split kindling. It was the kind of shared work that made a place feel whole. Elias realized anyone watching would see them as a pair now, not just a man keeping shelter over a stranger. By midday, he knew they would have to go back into town. Salt and lamp oil were low, and a broken hinge needed replacing. He thought of the men who had ridden to his place, of the looks on the boardwalk last time. He didn't want her to face it, but keeping her hidden would send a message he didn't mean to give. The question many might ask, would he stand beside her openly, without shame, pressed harder on him than before? "Naya," he said as they sat over a bowl of beans, "we'll go to town today. Together. You walk at my side." Her eyes met his, steady though shadowed with worry. She nodded once. "I walk." They hitched the wagon and rode in, the road long and bare. At the mercantile, the usual heads turned, the whispers rising behind hands. This time, Elias didn't keep his gaze ahead. He set his hand over hers where it rested on her lap, a clear mark for all to see. She stiffened, then let it stay. Inside, Mrs. Bonham greeted them with a small nod, no surprise in her eyes. She gathered what they asked for and added a length of heavier cloth. "Weather's turning," she said, sliding it across the counter toward Naya. "Best keep warm." Naya lowered her head but said clearly, "Thank you." The improvement in her English was noticeable, and Elias saw Mrs. Bonham's brow lift slightly in respect. Outside, the test came quick. The same rider from before leaned against a post, hat tipped low. "Brannock," he drawled. "Guess she's yours now, eh?" His tone dripped with insult. Elias stepped down from the wagon and faced him full on. "She's mine in name and choice," he said, voice level but carrying to the edges of the street. "You got something to say about it, you say it to me." "Not her." The rider smirked, spat, but when Elias didn't move, didn't blink, he turned away with a mutter. The boardwalk quieted. Some looked down, others looked away, but none stepped forward. Elias climbed back to the wagon, took the reins, and guided them out of town with Naya still at his side. The road home felt lighter than the one in. She sat straighter, her shawl drawn close, but her chin higher than before. At the creek, where they stopped to water the mule, she spoke in a low voice. "You say my name? In town. Not hide. I won't hide you," Elias answered, truth plain in his tone. "Not from them. Not from anyone." Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. She reached across, touched his hand briefly, then drew back. That touch carried more than words. That evening, back at the farm, she set the new cloth across the table, already measuring with her eyes where to cut. He sat watching her, the lamplight catching in her hair. The question that listeners might have asked, did Elias mean for her to stay, not just a night or a week, but truly, had been answered in the street that day. He had spoken her name, claimed her beside him, and she had not pulled away. Later, as the fire burned low, Naya stepped close to where Elias sat, her hand brushing his shoulder. He looked up, and she leaned down, pressing her lips softly to his. No fear, no hesitation, just choice. This time, Elias did not hold back. He rose, his arms circling her, their mouths meeting again with the weight of something that had been building since the first night she drank water from his hand. The kiss lingered, not rushed, not stolen, but real. When they pulled apart, she whispered one word, steady and clear. "Husband." Elias's chest tightened, and he answered in kind, his voice deep. "Wife." And with those words, the house and the barn, once empty and worn, belonged to them both. Spring settled over the farm with a steadiness that Elias had not felt in years. The yard that once looked weathered and forgotten now showed signs of care. Wood neatly stacked by the porch, the trough scrubbed bright, the barn swept and smelling of clean straw. The fields were being turned again, not in haste, but with purpose, the mule pulling steady under Elias's hand while Naya walked alongside, dropping seed with a careful rhythm. What had been his solitary burden was now work shared, and every corner of the place showed it. Inside the house, the changes were just as clear. The table, once bare, now carried stitched cloth Naya had made from the bolt they'd bought in town. Shelves that had gathered dust for years now held jars of beans and dried herbs she had laid up herself. Elias noticed how often she filled silence with small movements, tidying, mending, keeping things in order. He realized listeners might have wondered earlier whether she was only passing through, whether she had a place of her own to return to. By now, the answer was plain. This was her place by her choice. But the world outside didn't forget so easily. A week after Elias had called her wife in town, Sheriff Keating rode up the path. He was a broad man, graying at the temples, known for his quiet way of handling disputes. He dismounted slow, tipped his hat, and glanced toward the house where Naya stood in the doorway. "Brannick," he said, "there's been talk. Some say you've taken in someone who doesn't belong." Elias wiped the dirt from his hands and faced him square. "She belongs here, with me. That's all that needs saying." The sheriff studied him, then looked past him at Naya, who stood firm in the doorway, eyes steady. After a moment, he nodded once. "Town won't bother you if you stand by your word. You've earned that much." He mounted again, rode off without another word. When the dust settled, Elias turned back to Naya. She had not moved, but her grip on the doorframe loosened. "They leave us?" she asked softly. "They'll leave us," Elias said, "because I won't let them do otherwise." That evening, he built a small fire by the cedar at the edge of the north field, the tree that shaded the grave of the wife and unborn child he had lost so many years ago. He had never brought anyone there, never spoken of it. Naya walked beside him, her shawl drawn close. When he stopped by the mound, he rested a hand on the cedar's rough bark. "This is where I buried them," he said quietly. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone because of it." Naya's eyes softened. She knelt, placed her hand against the earth, then rose again. "You're not alone now," she said, voice firm. Elias felt a tightness in his chest ease, something long locked finally lifting. He turned to her, took her hand, and said, "No, not anymore." Back at the house, they sat close by the stove. The day's work had worn them both, but neither moved away. Elias finally spoke the words he had held back. I want you to stay. Not for a season. Not until the town forgets. I want you to be my wife, proper. Naya's breath caught, and for a moment she looked at him as if weighing whether this was truly choice. Then she nodded, her hand tightening in his. I stay. I wife. The days that followed carried no more threats, only labor and quiet peace. Elias built a new door for the barn, cut straight and hung solid. Naya stitched curtains for the house, pale cloth that caught the spring light. They worked together, ate together, slept together without fear. The whispers in town faded, replaced by shrugs and, from some, grudging respect. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields lay dark with fresh seed, Naya stepped out onto the porch and called back into the house. Husband, she said, her voice clear in the quiet air. Elias came out, wiping his hands, and answered, wife. The words settled between them not as trial, but as truth. For the first time in years, Elias felt his home was not just land and wood, but life again. And for the first time in Naya's long, hard journey, she had a place where no one could drive her out. Together, they had built it, not from charity, not from pity, but from choice. And that choice held.